Welcome to this seminar. My name is David Holloway. I'm former co-director of CSAC, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our two speakers. The topic is the 1969 nuclear crisis, confusion, contingency, and China. Well, at least has the advantage of alliteration. And our two speakers are Joseph Torigian, who's known to people here. He was a pre-doc and a postdoc here at CSAC several years ago. He's now at the Hoover Institution and is also an assistant professor at the School of International Studies at American University. And David Logan, who is working with Joseph on a project on 1969, is an assistant professor of political science at Tufts, the Fletcher School of Diplomacy at Tufts. So this is a crisis that is often mentioned, but not understood in great detail. And so it's great that these David and Joseph have been working on it, and we're looking forward very much to hearing what conclusions you are drawing from your study. Thank you.
David?
So, who's first? Oh, good. Yeah.
Great. So, well, first of all, we'll be presenting only one part of our project on 1969. So to paraphrase something that Alfred Hitchcock said about his movies, we were trying to make every scene a short story. So people often think of the 1969 as one crisis, but in fact, the dynamics at any given moment are actually quite different from each other. So we have a book project that tries to lay out the empirics in full, but because we're also interested in showing what our parts of it as article length projects to emphasize some of the things that are the most important. So there is a forthcoming article by me at Journal of Cold War Studies, Echoes of June 1941 and March 1969, Intelligence and Escalation on the Far Eastern Front, and another article that you read for today and upon which we will be presenting, which looks at the issues of confusion and contingency. I also have a project that is on the missile and nuclear program in China during the Cultural Revolution that is separate, but will feed into this broader question of what 1969 looked like. So I thought I would begin. Not so much a story of bad sources, but trying to collect as many different sources as possible and use them to make a mosaic. Some of the corners will be filled in more clearly than others, but as David will share in a moment, sometimes it's those areas where we lack clarity even now that are the most interesting. And it's striking how little we know, even though we've collected a lot of exciting documents. Some of the documents, it's really lucky that we have them because they are no longer available. People think of the Russian Federation moving in a particular direction that prevents the study of its history, but up until February of 2022, before the brutal invasion of Ukraine, it was really exciting actually to be able to do research in Russia because the party archives, the foreign ministry archives were open in a way that was quite extraordinary. So for this particular project, what we have are the daily GRU reports. Now, GRU, of course, was Soviet military intelligence. We have from the United States the presidential daily briefs, which is a sort of somewhat similar kind of resource in Washington, D.C. But the PDBs that have been declassified are actually still heavily redacted. These GRU daily reports are not. We also have foreign ministry archive documents from AVPRF, in which we can see especially what the Russians were telling their allies and Western powers about what they understood was going on. In terms of Chinese material, again, you have to be creative about how you find things. People often ask me how it's still possible to still do research on China, given that the current leader of China is someone who believes that critical versions of the party's past are actually attempts to weaponize history to destroy the regime. He uses quite often this phrase historical nihilism, and he's described how the study of party history and the continuous rebaptism of party genes is a way to end dynastic cycle. This is literally how Xi Jinping thinks about history, so you can see how there might be some challenges to looking at his country. But counterintuitively, often it's easier to do research on China using Chinese documents in the United States than it is in China. And the reason for that is American universities and databases have been quite resourceful about making available documents that one way or another somehow appear in their collection. And these range from Politburo Standing Committee documents, internal speeches by figures like Zhou Enlai, Hua Guofeng, that if you read our work, you'll see is actually quite extraordinary. And I see David Shambaugh nodding his head. He knows as well as anyone in this room that official party histories, party history journals, Hong Kong publications are really quite interesting. There are some tricks that work for both China and Russia. You may laugh when I say that YouTube is a quite significant source. So especially for my article on March of 1969, I was able to find interviews of soldiers that fought on the front line in that march on YouTube. Now, you need to be careful with this kind of thing because none of those videos are still available. So you need to save them. That's quite crucial, right? And there's different softwares that you can use for that. Memoirs are also extremely important. I know David Holloway also has used these to great effect. So whenever I see a new name, it goes through WorldCat, Duxiu, CNKI, plain old Google, and it's like a homing beacon. So if you can map out everyone who was in the 2nd Artillery, everyone who was in the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces, and you do that kind of thing, it's a little more challenging with Russian because of cases. You can really find some pretty amazing stuff. As well as interviews. So when I was here at Stanford a few years ago, David Holloway and Chip Blacker were part of these track 2 conversations with both Russians and Chinese who have their own understanding, and how they remember this crisis is quite interesting. But this was a global crisis. So as David Logan will talk about more in a moment, one of the most striking things about the 1969 crisis is how much China and Russia were not just looking at each other, but what other countries were saying and doing, but also what China and Russia were saying to other countries, how they were explaining their own behavior. And also diplomats are smart people. So seeing how they were judging the situation can also be quite valuable. So we have documents from Japan, India, Eastern Europe, Italy, United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Canada. Canada is actually some of the most important documents we have because the Americans are telling the Canadians, because they trust the Canadians, what they know. So the trick here, of course, is what you do if you don't speak a lot of different languages. So often what I would do is I would use FBIS, Foreign Broadcasting Information Service, to make a list of every time a Soviet or a Chinese leader met with a foreigner, and then email those archives and say, do you have a transcript of this conversation? OCR that document, turn it into a Word document and run it through Google Translate, find out what's the most valuable, and then find somebody to make sure those particular lines are translated as effectively as possible. And we did that with several different foreign archives to great effect. American documents also, as David Logan will explain in a moment, even though this was a China-Russia conflict, what the United States was saying and doing was absolutely decisive. And I want to emphasize here that just using FRUS, the Foreign Relations of the United States, which is publicly available on websites, is not enough for this kind of research. Because if you look at the chapters in our book, you will see that actually the most useful material is stuff from the Presidential Archives, NARA 2, or the State Department FOIA website, or the CIA CREST website. So you can't just, you may have heard of the expression of the drunk only looking for his keys where there's light. FRUS is the light, but it might not necessarily be the most useful information that you need. Also, what comes out in this project is that media and journalists and what they were saying and doing and what they knew was absolutely decisive, right? So who in the government and why was telling journalists certain things and how they wrote that up? Decisive. So what we also have, you'll see a lot of citations to newspaper articles. Just because it's public information doesn't mean you can ignore it. But also we've tried to find out whether or not those journalists had personal papers or memoirs to see if they had even more detail on those sources than they did elsewhere. I'll give you one quick example of where our creativity really came in use. So what the Australian Communist Party knew about the crisis, for reasons that are a little complicated, was actually quite important. So I reached out to the family of this Australian communist, and this family had in their possession a document from the Australian intelligence services of them eavesdropping on this communist. And so they had a good record of what exactly he thought the Soviets had told him, which actually proved to be quite important, right? I want to speak briefly about methodology before I turn the stage over to David Logan. I've put up a picture of the Cuban Missile Crisis because it's David Holloway's work on this crisis that shaped our thinking about how to study nuclear crises. So what David Holloway does is something quite different from common approaches within political science when it comes to the study of nuclear crises. Political scientists often are interested in average causal effect studies, medium end studies, 2x2 studies. But I think what David Holloway's work shows very clearly is that even though you can learn a lot by looking at variation across cases, often these Humean approaches, by which I mean average causal effect or Mills methods, often hide what's most interesting and how much you can learn from the tiniest of details. So David Holloway shows that when it came to the Cuban Missile Crisis, what's interesting isn't that it was a peaceful outcome, but how close we were to a rather different outcome, which for political science coders would say that this was an outcome where it was a peaceful resolution, but David Holloway shows that, well, actually, that was not an inevitable result, given what the situation looked like at the time. So I think what David Logan and I understand him to be doing, and what I write about in an article for Global Studies Quarterly, is that he's using a specific case to better conceptualize the structures and mechanisms that help make crises like the one in 1969 legible. But it's not just history. We're not just saying what happened. And the reason I partnered with David Logan on this project is because he's the best person that I know to take the raw stuff that I'm finding and draw the most meaningful conclusions for the nuclear watching community. So now I'll turn it over to David Logan.
Thanks, Joseph. Thanks to Kate and Harold for all the work that went into setting this up, and thanks to you all for being here today. So as Joseph said, what we're presenting today is really a snapshot. Can't find the mouse. I'll just go like that. Of a broader book project, but what we're presenting is a rough draft or a first draft of one snapshot that looks at what is essentially the most studied aspect of the 1969 crisis to date, which is an examination of the nuclear signals and the nuclear dynamics within the crisis. So the rest of the presentation, we've divided into 6 parts. First, we'll motivate it, not just through looking at all of these wonderful new sources, and credit to Joseph for leading the charge there, but also by looking at the growing salience of nuclear weapons today, and the greater risks, perhaps, of nuclear crises, particularly between China and the United States. Second, we'll situate the 1969 crisis within the literature, talk about how it has been used to study broader dynamics within political science and history. And then third, we'll move to the meat of the argument, which is identifying several reasons that we have to doubt that the Soviets were, in fact, involved in a systematic and deliberate campaign of nuclear signaling against China. Fourth, if our argument is correct and that such a campaign was not undertaken, we'll try to explain why Chinese observers believe that this was the case. Fifth, we'll touch briefly on alternative explanations, and then we'll conclude with a discussion of what we think are some of the general lessons that we might take away for both scholarship and for policy today. So, we motivate this, one, by the inherent value of the 1969 crisis. And as Joseph mentioned, we have access to all these wonderful new sources, which allow us to investigate new dynamics in the crisis, but also revisit previous arguments. But we also motivate it by acknowledging the fact that in the last several years, nuclear weapons have taken on greater salience. Russia's nuclear threats as part of its invasion of Ukraine have raised concerns about nuclear escalation there. China is involved in the country's most significant nuclear expansion in its history, and there's growing concerns about deterrence failures or nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula. In addition, there's growing concerns about a nuclear crisis in particular involving the U.S.-China. I don't think we need to give you data to convince anyone that U.S.-China relations have deteriorated in the last several years, but I think it helps make the point, so we'll show you a picture. This figure plots data from a research project at the Tsinghua University Institute of International Relations, which is one of the leading civilian homes of strategic thought in China. And scholars there have tried to quantify the state of China's foreign relations with several major powers. And we can quibble about the methodology, but I think it's at least helpful to sort of show a Chinese perspective on U.S.-China relations over time. And we superimposed these rectangles illustrating the time period in which the U.S. and China were involved in major crises, the Korean War, the several Taiwan Strait crises, and the military exercises most recently in 2022. And I just want to highlight that according to this research project, although there's been stabilization in U.S.-China relations in the last couple of years, they identify them as being worse than at any time in history since the Korean War. And so this is, again, motivating concerns about a potential U.S.-China crisis in the future and what might be the nuclear dimension of that crisis. So enter the 1969 crisis. This is important, not just because it is a nuclear crisis, but also because it involves China. And it's believed to be the only time in China's history that it's placed its nuclear weapons on alert. So it sort of occupies a special place in China's nuclear history. We're not the first people to study this crisis. Joseph alluded to several other works. We have people in the room who have done excellent work on this, and we're building on previous excellent and influential works, some of which are pictured here on the screen. This is a key case in the study of Cold War history and China's foreign relations. But the element of the case that has attracted the most scholarly attention is its nuclear dynamics. And nuclear crises are thankfully very rare. But that means that when we're trying to draw general lessons about them, getting the story right for any particular crisis is particularly important because they carry a lot of inferential weight given the relatively small number of cases. And one of the things that all of this previous work have in common on the crisis is they either explicitly argue or seem to implicitly assume that the Soviets were engaged in a deliberate and systematic campaign of nuclear signaling and nuclear coercion against China. And this is where our work tries to contribute by challenging, or at the very least nuancing, that understanding. And again, going back to this argument that although the Chinese may have believed that such a campaign was underway, we have many reasons to doubt that. And really the crisis is best understood not as sort of a mechanistic attempt at pulling signaling levers and clearly sending signals to the receiver, but an event that is suffused with contingency, confusion, misperception. So why do we have reason to doubt that the Soviets were engaged in this systematic campaign of nuclear signaling? We offer 5 reasons in the paper, and I'll summarize them here. Happy to talk more in detail during the Q&A. And again, I would encourage you to read the paper if you're interested. So one is reviewing all of these news sources, we find very little authoritative evidence that there was a top-down decision to engage in this kind of systematic nuclear signaling. 2, we in addition find real-time skepticism from outside observers, particularly in the United States, but elsewhere across the world, that the Soviets were intending to signal to China in this way. 3rd, we also find extensive evidence of Soviet denials that they were involved in nuclear signaling, both in private and in public, and in instances in which we would assume that there might be little benefit to strategic ambiguity or to lying. 4th, we find significant evidence of Soviet concerns about escalation, which would appear to conflict with some of the logic of resorting to high-risk nuclear signaling. And then finally, for many of the moves that are often identified as examples of Soviet nuclear signaling, we believe that there are superior alternative explanations, such as misperception, entrepreneurial elites, or more bureaucratic processes. So first, first evidence, we again find little to no compelling evidence that the Soviets intended to threaten or use nuclear weapons against China or to engage in this systematic campaign of nuclear signaling. I think one of the things that's notable, at least for me when I go through the sources, is the Soviet officials in their internal deliberations seem to give far less attention and weight to the nuclear dimension than their Chinese counterparts. There are some exceptions, but I think that those in some ways reinforce part of our argument and our attempt to nuance it. And I'll just highlight two of them here. So the first is that the very few examples that we can find of the Soviets discussing an attempt to use nuclear weapons in the crisis or nuclear threats usually are done so with reference to Chinese first strikes. And so we have an example here from a Soviet military attaché saying, quote, the Russians would not hesitate to use nuclear weapons against the Chinese if they attacked with major forces. The Russians would permit the Chinese to penetrate Russian territory to a sufficient depth and then employ tactical nuclear weapons against the Chinese, but on Russian soil. They would not employ nuclear weapons against the Chinese except on their own territory unless the Chinese initiated nuclear weapons employment first against the Russians, unquote. Perhaps the only data point that we find that I think is very explicit in the role of nuclear signaling in trying to convince the Chinese to come to the negotiating table comes from an interview published in a book in the late 1990s, roughly 3 decades after the crisis, and from a Soviet military official who, best we can tell, was a mid-career officer at the time of the crisis and likely serving in East Germany. And so someone who we would not expect to have been privy to some of these dynamics during the crisis. Second, in addition to this lack of authoritative evidence, we also find that contemporary observers of the crisis were very skeptical that the Soviets were engaged in this kind of signaling campaign. We see the skepticism in US intelligence reports and diplomatic cables. We see it in the internal deliberations of other countries around the world, and we see it in contemporary media. I'll just highlight 2 examples here. The first is a New York Times article published on August 27th, just a day before China issues a general mobilization order to prepare for war, and one that is often used or is contemporaneous with other supposed Soviet nuclear signals. And the article reads that, quote, State Department officials discounted reports that the Soviet Union had been sounding out its Warsaw Pact allies about their likely reactions to a preemptive Soviet strike on communist China. According to the article, State Department sources said that such reports had been received, but are not being taken very seriously. We also see similar skepticism in authoritative internal US documents. Here we have an excerpt from a memo written by Secretary of State Rogers to the US Embassy in Moscow and the Consul General in Hong Kong, saying, quote, we do not, however, have any quantity or pattern of such references, which would support conclusion that the Soviets are engaged in a systematic effort to canvass potential reaction to some specific course of action, such as airstrikes against Chinese nuclear installation. And we see this again from non-US observers, a real skepticism that the Soviets were engaged in this kind of an effort. Third is we also see significant Soviet denials that they would be engaged in a nuclear signaling campaign of this type. Again, we see this in denials to the press, denials to diplomatic counterparts throughout the world. But I think most significantly for our purposes is we see it in internal documents that are not intended for public consumption. And so as we can talk about later in the presentation, one of the alternative explanations sometimes is that maybe the Soviets were trying to maintain some plausible deniability or strategic ambiguity, but we see in internal documents reference to the imaginary threat that the Chinese are hyping and a desire to de-escalate the crisis and not rely on nuclear signaling. And this is one of the prominent examples from a report to the Politburo from the GRU chief saying that regardless of the recently reserved tone of anti-Soviet propaganda, the slogan of the threat of war on the part of American imperialism and social imperialism is not discarded in China. The Chinese leadership is taking advantage of the imaginary threat in order to create tensions in the country for domestic political reasons. Fourth, we also see throughout the crisis what appears to be a genuine concern among Soviet decision makers for controlling the bounds of escalation in the crisis, both vertically and horizontally. And this would conflict with some of the underlying logic of a nuclear signaling campaign, which would try to increase the risks in order to bring China to the negotiating table. As the crisis began, Soviet border guards were issued very strict rules of engagement out of concern for not escalating the crisis and the level of violence. And then as it progressed, we also see significant Soviet interest in negotiating the crisis in an attempt to de-escalate it. And I want to quote from one of the major sources. I think one of the most vivid anecdotes from the crisis is in mid-October, a Soviet negotiating team delegation was preparing to fly to Beijing in order to potentially negotiate a resolution to the crisis. And as the day of the delegation's arrival approached, Beijing was gripped by this paranoia of an impending strike. On October 17th, Zhou Enlai told old comrades in Beijing that Mao had ordered them to prepare for war. We have instances of one of Mao's bodyguards being issued equipment that would only be relevant for surviving a post-strike by the Soviets. And one senior Chinese defense official decided to give up his daily afternoon nap because he was too anxious about the prospect that the incoming plane, instead of ferrying a Soviet negotiating delegation, was secretly carrying an atomic bomb destined for Beijing. However, far from concealing plans for a surprise attack, the documents that we have suggest that Soviet officials viewed the October meeting as a real diplomatic opportunity. We have internal memos identifying specific sections of the border that were ripe for compromise, suggesting that the delegation was given real substantive orders and encouraging them to try to find, quote, a mutually acceptable compromise formula, unquote. So as the Chinese were preparing for a surprise nuclear strike, the Soviets appeared bent on de-escalating the crisis. The last reason that we have to doubt some of the supposed instances of Soviet nuclear signaling is that for many of them, we believe that there are superior alternative explanations that often depend on understanding, again, confusion, contingency, misperception, and the overall atmosphere of the crisis dynamic. And here I'll highlight two examples. So one is a Soviet official delivering remarks in Washington, D.C. to a State Department counterpart, asking the State Department counterpart how the United States might respond if the Soviets initiated a first strike against China. And this meeting has taken on great importance in some of the secondary literature. One author who has written about the 1969 crisis, one scholar, describes it as, quote, the most potent Soviet nuclear threat, unquote. Another scholar of the crisis describes it as, quote, the most serious approach by Soviet officials, unquote. So this has taken on great weight in our understanding of the crisis. And then a second event that's frequently identified as evidence of Soviet nuclear signaling are remarks delivered by CIA Director Richard Helms at an August 27th lunch with journalists that the Soviet Union was considering such a strike. Scholars have frequently identified the Helms lunch as a significant event because it reinforced views that the Soviets were canvassing for possible reactions to a strike. It also implied that US officials themselves found it credible. And it comes just one day before the Chinese Central Committee's issuance of the General Mobilization Order on August 28th. However, as we detail in the paper, there's significant reasons to doubt that both of these were deliberate efforts of Soviet nuclear signaling. One of these facts is that the remarks by the Soviet official in DC were not even taken as credible by the US officials themselves. The president's daily brief concluded, and we excerpted on the slide here, quote, it may be that the official Davidov's point blank question was self-inspired, an entrepreneurial bureaucrat. He is uninhibited, unusually so, and often speaks unreservedly on a variety of subjects. For instance, in the same week, he had two wide-ranging conversations with other US officials in which he did not raise this question. If Davidov was in fact executing an assignment to probe U.S. reaction, we would expect the same question repeated by other and more authoritative Soviet contacts. And so I allude back to some of Joseph's comments earlier about the importance of thinking through the thought processes of diplomats and decision makers at the time, rather than perhaps imposing our own view of the situation after the fact. And for the sake of time, I'll skip over some of the details on the Richard Helms lunch. But there's many sources that suggest that his remarks about the possible Soviet strike, far from being indicative of US intelligence reports, may have been simply fabrications. So if our argument is correct, and the Soviets were not engaged in the systematic and deliberate nuclear signaling campaign, then how can we understand Chinese fears? Because Chinese fears were intense, especially as the crisis progressed, and were very sincere regardless of Soviet intentions. Often signals are what receivers make of them, regardless of the intent with which they are delivered. And so in the paper, we identify 4 explanations for why the Chinese became so concerned about a possible strike. The first is that even if it wasn't part, these various signals weren't part of a campaign, you certainly can identify many different instances that could fit into this narrative of Soviet nuclear signaling. Second, in internal Chinese documents, we find evidence of observers often applying these window logics, suggesting that the Soviets must be hungry to strike now while China's nuclear forces are weak, rather than waiting until later when China's nuclear forces would be strong. Third, we also find evidence of Chinese decision makers employing historical analogies that appear to have shaped their understanding of the crisis based on past crises. We have one example here from Zhou Enlai, saying that, quote, on the eve of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, he wanted to negotiate with the Soviet Union. Later they negotiated, they even signed a mutual non-aggression treaty. At the time, there was a big lulling on the Soviet Union, and the result was that Hitler tore up the agreement, did a surprise attack, and the Soviet Union suffered a lot. Similarly, when Japan launched a secret attack on Pearl Harbor, that was also a sudden attack. They also created a lot of peaceful signs. They also sent a negotiating delegation to the United States, unquote. So again, using historical analogies to shape the perceptions of Soviet signals that may have been intended for de-escalation and negotiation. And then finally, and we don't have an example here, but I think one thing that becomes very clear in a lot of the Chinese sources is the extent to which the crisis atmosphere really affected perceptions of signals. There was a real paranoia, especially in the fall, and this complicated attempts at clear signaling on the part of the Soviets. For reasons of time, I'll touch on this very briefly, but we also, we try to explore alternative explanations. I think Joseph is 100% correct that there's still much that we don't know about the crisis. And so 2 that we explored is 1, whether Soviet signaling was perhaps deliberately ambiguous, again, to maintain plausible deniability. There's been a lot of work about the idea of a nuclear taboo, and perhaps the Soviets would not want to pay diplomatic costs for appearing to engage in overly explicit nuclear saber rattling. And then the second alternative explanation is that maybe Soviet signaling was not a coordinated effort, but was rather the result of small groups. We don't find very much convincing evidence of this. Some Chinese intelligence suggested that this might be the case. But I think that even if there is evidence of this, it still reinforces our overall argument about the challenges of managing a crisis. That even in the midst of one of the most significant crises in the history of Sino-Soviet relations, Soviet leaders were unable to control the national security bureaucracy. It suggests some humility in our understanding of the crisis and the ability to control similar crises going forward. So in concluding, we think that our work suggests several different conclusions and implications for both scholarship and for policy. So the first is that it emphasizes the obstacles to interstate signaling and crisis bargaining. And there's been a lot of really great work done on this recently, some really interesting survey experimental work. And I think this is just a great example of how those signals are very messy, and often there are gaps between the sender and the receiver. Second, we talk about how the strategic nuclear balance perhaps affected the crisis in very mixed and nuanced ways. We don't have good evidence that the Soviets were emboldened by their strategic nuclear superiority, but we do have some suggestions that perhaps some of the Chinese paranoia emerged from their perception of nuclear inferiority. Third, it also suggests that perhaps even ambiguous or uncertain nuclear threats can generate some coercive effect, maybe giving us echoes of what we're seeing in Ukraine today. Even signals that aren't very explicit may still be impactful. Fourth, from a scholarly perspective, I think this is an important call to, in the study of interstate crises, and especially nuclear crises, give greater attention to the role of contingency. The course of the crisis was shaped by bureaucratic challenges, misperception, and we're all aware of these. These have been discussed extensively in the literature, and we know that these may influence a crisis, but it's very difficult to know the particular ways in which they'll influence a crisis, especially before it occurs. And then the last one, crises are messy and dangerous. This is obvious, but I think it's important to emphasize there's been a lot of very good work done recently about how to manage a potential crisis between the US and China. But I think this is also a call for spending more effort thinking about how do we avoid getting into one in the first place. So we have other potential lines of investigation that Joseph talked about earlier. And questions that we're also interested in, what do you think might be important? What would you be interested in? I think we're still trying to grapple with just the volume of sources that we have available. But I'll stop there for the sake of time, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. I think it'll be a good discussion. In accordance with our usual practice, I'll call on fellows first to speak. And if I don't know people's names, please forgive me. For various reasons, I've not been here that much. So questions? Yeah. Can you say who you are, please?
Yeah, Caleb Pomeroy, Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow here at CSAC. This is a really impressive project. I was just curious, could you say a little bit more about the misperception and paranoia that you say existed in China at the time, but got sort of short empirical shrift in the talk? Thanks.
Yeah, I think for me, I think the most, I'm curious to hear Joseph's thoughts, but I think the most vivid and compelling example of it is really just the disconnect between Soviet preparations for the delegation visit in late October and how China was perceiving Soviet actions at the time. One thing that I didn't talk about, but we talked a little bit about in the paper, is it's interesting how there appears to be a little bit of a disconnect between when Soviet actions, I think, could plausibly be interpreted as stronger nuclear signals, like earlier in the crisis and maybe in August. At that time, I think China was relatively less concerned. And then as we move into October, you could argue that I think some of those Soviet actions had dissipated, or at least third-party observers found them to not be as compelling. And then this is when Chinese anxieties are reaching their peak. And I think it comes through in the language. It's not always clear that there's a reference to like a source in explaining Chinese anxieties. It's just this general fear of a Soviet surprise attack, and they're trying to trick us essentially with these moves toward de-escalation.
So another thing to keep in mind here that wasn't discussed in detail, this was 3 years into the Cultural Revolution, and it's hard to overstate just how dysfunctional the Chinese decision-making apparatus was at this particular time. One of the things that we've been able to get are internal histories of the Chinese investigation department. This is, of course, their intelligence apparatus. They were at war with each other for years during the Cultural Revolution. Literally, the head of this department was finding himself subjected to struggle sessions. So when you are facing your own employees screaming at you and yelling at you and beating at you, you can see how you might not have a lot of time to pursue sources within the Soviet Union or interpret those materials. We know that Mao was always very deeply skeptical about individuals from the foreign ministry or the security apparatus and what they told him. There was one conversation between him and Kissinger where they both talked about how bureaucrats in both of their systems were entirely useless, something that they bonded over. Also, the relationship between Mao Zedong and the defense minister Lin Biao was deeply problematic. So Lin Biao was an individual who I think understood Mao better than anyone else. It makes him interesting for party history because this was someone who really was able to read the chairman and really was especially careful, but still lost the chairman's trust, which is deeply revealing for how the party works. But when Lin Biao did this mobilization that David Logan just mentioned, it was written in a way that infuriated Mao because Mao concluded that Lin Biao was getting a little bit ahead of himself and demonstrating authority in a way that was challenging. So when you have this kind of environment, the game isn't to read the situation objectively and try to put your country onto a better path. It's to read what Mao thinks and bring it to Mao better than anyone else and impress Mao because you know what Mao wants you to do. Well, this is not a good way of creating policy, right? I'll give you one example of this. One thing that's in the paper, but that we didn't have time to discuss today was in 1969, there was a rushed order, a sudden decision to move giant facilities attached to the Second Ministry of Machine Building. This is their nuclear military industrial complex in a way that was disastrous. And the scientists were saying, we can't move it that quickly. And there were all of these safety issues. And by the way, they were all struggling against each other and executing each other at public sessions within the 221 complex. All of this is going on in the background. Again, there's also, they're damaging their own ability to project power because of these power struggles within the country. So when you have that kind of a mindset of radicalism and Mao in charge, then it's easy for this kind of war hysteria to appear in a way that even if the Soviet Union is doing certain things that could be construed as a challenge or a signal, but that other people doubt, if you're in that kind of atmosphere, it's really easy to read into it in a way that may be reading more into it than is actually there.
Yep. Okay. Yes, no, Rhiannon. Yeah.
Hi, Rhiannon Nielsen. I'm a cybersecurity postdoctoral fellow here. Thank you so much for your talk. I think what I'm most curious about is, to an extent, echoes your first question up there on the board, which is if a version of this crisis was happening today, to what extent do you think new technologies or new forms of communication like social media or online influence operations or even hacking into the communications between a lot of these officials at play, do you think that that would help clarify our understandings of nuclear signaling, or do you think that would just help further muddy the waters? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one I haven't thought about before. I think this will be a good thing to put into the book project and the paper. I think the challenge would be not just the access to the information, but how it's interpreted. And I think part of that is also going to depend on what are the domestic political circumstances within both of the countries. And that's something that I think about. Obviously, I don't think in either state will we have anywhere near the same level of sort of chaos that we would see in China at the time. But I think the background quality of the relationship before the crisis, and even the level of personal connections is going to affect how any of these signals are interpreted. And that's something that I worry about, certainly.
I think an interesting question to think about this too would be how technology is created the ability for deepfakes, videos that aren't real, and whether or not that makes it harder to figure out what signals are coming out of a particular country, or whether certain actors with questionable loyalties and agendas might insert themselves into this kind of environment in a way that makes it harder for anybody to understand what's going on. It may increase the speed that people feel that they need to respond to these types of crises, right? So if information is traveling more quickly because people are able to see what different countries are doing, the fact that a lot of what countries do is now available to the public in a way that wasn't previously because of satellites and that kind of thing. All of these, arguably, but again, I think it's something that maybe other people who study, know more about technology than we do could advise us on. It could be even more messy. But in 1969, it was already messy, and it was really dangerous.
I think that's a great point about the, it's not just how our elites receiving and interpreting these signals, but the proliferation of like remote sensing technology. You can go on Google Earth and you can count Soviet mobile missile tells at certain sites around the world. And so it's harder to control access to information. And therefore, I think harder to control domestic political dynamics. So it may be hard to de-escalate a crisis, especially if your public is clamoring for an escalation in some respect. And then maybe there's also third parties who are engaging in a certain way, which makes it more difficult.
Harold.
Great. Super interesting talk, Joseph, David. I want to follow up a little bit on what Joseph was just talking about. One of the things he used to motivate the talk was concerns around nuclear signaling and the Ukraine crisis. One of the other things that's come out of the Ukraine crisis is concerns about authoritarian regimes and how leaders receive information, especially their propensity to be staffed by yes men or yes women who are telling them what they want to hear. Which described China sounds a little bit like that's what's going on for Mao. So to what extent was this an issue on the Soviet side? It may discuss the relative dynamics, but also just to what extent did the Soviets worry about Mao getting bad information, and therefore that might contribute to their uncertainty about exactly how they're signaling or how to approach the crisis.
Yeah, you must be reading my mail, because this is something I think about a lot, especially because I focus so much on Xi Jinping, and I'm often asked whether the lineup that he picked at the 20th Party Congress will facilitate pathologies in decision making, because he's surrounded by people who will only tell him what he wants to think. And the broader question of the politics of information in Leninist regimes in particular, and authoritarian regimes more broadly, I think that it's tricky to say that authoritarian regimes are just bad at what they do, in the sense that there is a politics of trying to see what the top person wants and bringing it to them. But there is also the real world, right? So I don't want to essentialize authoritarian regimes as being completely incapable of making good decisions, right? So one party historian told me a story about how in the 1980s, the foreign ministry in China was tasked with the mission of writing up a document on whether China should improve its relationship with Russia. And they wrote 2 documents, waiting until they knew what Deng wanted so they could give him the correct document, right? But on the other hand, it's if the situation reaches a point where it's obvious that things are failing, if you don't at least hint to the top leader that something is going wrong, you can get in trouble for that too. So you can't only err on the side of telling the top leader what they want, because then if this person finds out that you're hiding things from them, then you're in trouble. But then again, if you're in charge of managing a particular issue and it's failing and you don't try to do something about it, you can get in trouble too for that, right? So here it gets really interesting, because part of it is the politics of personal political skill, right? So if you're a deputy and you're able to put things in a way that the top leader can accept, that's pretty impressive. Or because you are so good or because you feel the top leader trusts you enough that even though you're a yes man and you were picked to be a yes man, counterintuitively, you can use that relationship to say, something is going wrong here, right? So I'm saying there's a lot of contingency. There's a lot of what we don't know. Sometimes the information politics of a particular issue can be important, in the sense that, let's say that Xi Jinping thinks he knows a lot about nuclear weapons, but he doesn't think he knows a lot about the economy, or this is just an example, right? So in some ways, the relationship with the deputy matters, but also just how much that person thinks they know on a particular issue. But then again, maybe they think they don't know about a particular issue at one point, and then they think they know more about it later. So all of these things are shifting. So there is that dynamic. There is this problem of yes men and how it feeds into problems. But I don't think we should completely essentialize it, because actually, to use a word we keep using, it can be quite contingent on what kind of information they're getting and how good it is.
I can offer
Go
quickly.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 pieces of evidence, sort of in favor of the argument that there will be sort of these yes people around, and there may be one against. So Caroline Milne, who I know from grad school and is now at the Institute of Defense Analyses, has done some really good work looking at how the Soviets viewed the strategic nuclear balance. And I think it has a great argument showing that the need to adhere to this narrative of eventual Soviet victory prevented Soviet defense officials from conducting more quote unquote like scientific nuclear exchange models, because you couldn't conduct it and then deliver a report that said that the Soviets were going to suffer more fatalities than the US. And so this is maybe one example how in the nuclear field we have authoritarian states in which politics are driving some of the decisions or the outputs that are being put before leaders. The second, I think Susan Shirk in her last book cites several Chinese officials saying that they would be worried to deliver bad news to the top. But we do have some evidence that I think Xi is getting a mixed view of certain things. So there's been a lot written recently about Xi's dissatisfaction with elements of the PLA modernization and feeling that it's not quite where it needs to be. And so I think, and at least in that respect, there are, again, like maybe it depends on the policy domain, right, and who has access, but there are examples, I think, of Xi getting sort of more mixed views.
Okay, Jim.
Jim Goldgeier, visiting scholar here at CSAC. Super interesting. One brief comment on Rhiannon's point. I think over time, going forward in crises, I think leaders will want to use AI to help with the decision making. So I think that'll make things interesting. You mentioned there was an American role in the crisis. I was just curious to hear more about what that was.
So you want to talk about unintended consequences, perverse outcomes. When and why did the Chinese finally believe that the Soviet nuclear threat was real? Well, it was because Helms, the head of the CIA, gave a briefing to American journalists that led the Chinese to think that the problem was real. And David Holloway has looked at this probably more than even David Logan and I have. And it seems that he just made it up because he wanted to cause trouble for the Russia-China relationship. So it wasn't the Soviets effectively nuclear signaling. In fact, they didn't even think they were really doing that much nuclear signaling. But then the Americans did them a big favor, which is they lied, and it worked, and it scared the Chinese. So does that fit a lot of our theories about how nuclear signaling works? Probably not, right? But it shows what politics is like, which is that it can operate in very surprising ways.
Norman. And then I have a question.
Thank you for a very interesting talk, and thank you, Joseph, for that layout too of research these days. That's very useful picture. But I wanted to ask about signaling in general, and this may be a field I just know nothing about. But what do you mean exactly by signaling? And there's a threat, right? You can threaten someone directly. You can threaten them indirectly. You can not threaten them, but still carry a big stick and make it clear you're carrying a big stick. So how do you think about this whole phenomenon of signaling, which can have many different sorts of dimensions, it seems to me? And does signaling mean all of these dimensions, including a direct threat? I'm gonna blow the hell out of you if you do X, Y, or Z. Is that a signal? So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's something that I struggle with. One way that I've tried to think about some of the nuclear signals or supposed nuclear signals in the '69 crisis is to compare them to the signals that we see today in Ukraine. And I try to think about which one do I think is more explicit, which one do I think is coming from a more authoritative source. And I feel like the signals that we see today in Ukraine, to me, and I'd be curious to hear other views, are clearly more explicit. They're coming directly from the national leader. There's obvious references to nuclear weapons. We don't see anything like that in the 1969 crisis. So when I think about the kind of signaling campaign that we're discussing, I think of it as being one, a deliberate top-down decision to sort of reference nuclear weapons and the fact that they may be used either deliberately or inadvertently, right, just heightening risk. And two, for the goal of intimidating the other side. And I don't think we have that. I think it raises a great point about there are latent signals that just exist because there are nuclear weapons possessed by the participants in the crisis. And then there are actions that you may take that could send a signal, even if it's not your intent, but you may be willing to accept that it sort of gives this collateral signal because you have some other secondary goal that's attached to it.
Yeah. Chip, you have a two finger, and then I have a question. Okay, go ahead.
This is fascinating. I think it's useful to remember that the problem of yes men in policymaking is not unique to authoritarian political systems. And it just complicates everything. It just messes with our kind of more rational conceptions, or what we want to think of, or more rational processes that undergird the policymaking process. So it's just a footnote as you guys work your way through this.
Yeah, I have a question, but first, about 20 years ago, I had the chance to interview 3 retired Russian strategic rocket force officers about the 1969 crisis. And one of them had served in Chita during the crisis. And I was asking questions on the assumption I'm thinking of it as a nuclear crisis until it wasn't going very well, until one of them said, I think you've got the wrong end of the stick here. We weren't worried about Chinese nuclear weapons. We were worried about 1 billion Chinese. Now, they weren't quite 1 billion at the time, but he said, what I have in my notes is he said 1 billion. And I think that's, so that kind of underscores the point you were making. I think it's right. But there still is a nuclear dimension to the crisis, which is very important. And I was told, or at least I know there was certainly a proposal to plant atomic mines along the border. Have you come up on the Soviet side? Have you come across that?
I'd have to check my notes on
Yeah,
that.
no, because that would be significant. Second thing is that maybe before the crisis, or maybe in 1969, the Soviet Union moved some of its medium-range systems away from the border because they thought there could be Chinese raids, maybe up to 50 kilometers in, to seize hold of an SS-4 or an SS-5. And the third thing, and you know about this, Joseph, that we were told that the commander of one of the military districts, I think at the time the Far East Military District, General Tolupko, actually on his own initiative paraded a number of Grad missile systems along the border so the Chinese would see them. And,
Not Grads.
Sorry?
Not Grads, but nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons, yeah. No, but I mean, they could fire nuclear.
Right.
Tactical nuclear weapons. And my understanding is that that played a role in his appointment either the next year or the year after that as commander-in-chief of the strategic rocket forces. So, and I found not, unfortunately, direct confirmation in the sources, but certainly hints that he played a very important role in resolving the crisis with China. So I mean, that's an interesting nuclear thing on various aspects. Have you found out anything?
So in my article, I'm not sure how much of this will end up in the book about specifically March, because it's very tactical. It's very Soviet civ mil down to the very lowest level. And there were some very serious problems with civil military relations within the Soviet army at that particular time. And when I was looking at these documents, it was amazing how limited Moscow had put in the rules of engagement for both border guards and Soviet military, because they were absolutely terrified of escalation, right? And so there were 2 days in March where there was a lot of fighting. The second one, which was a bigger engagement on March 15, the Soviets were just getting completely destroyed by the Chinese because they weren't getting an order from Moscow giving them permission to use more heavy weaponry. And even now, with Brezhnev's diaries and with all of these interviews and with all of these YouTube videos and with all of these documents, it's not clear who finally said, okay, we're going to use the Grads that just completely decimated the Chinese forces. And if I had to guess from the weight of the evidence, it was the Soviets on the ground, frustrated that Moscow wasn't giving them an answer, and they were seeing their own people die, that they decided that they were just going to take the risk, right? And so on the Chinese side, what's really interesting is we have this idea of communist regimes as having very, very close control over their forces. But there were either Red Guards or border troops who, again, because of the Cultural Revolution, again, because of the breakdown of central authority, were doing things that were leading the Soviets to conclude that Beijing was running an operation deliberately to continue to cause trouble and create this bleeding ulcer for them, when actually they were overinterpreting what actually was going on, right? So do I think it's possible that a Soviet officer on the ground would do something like what you just described? Well, it fits my understanding of what these guys felt that they could do, even without reporting back up to the top. And did the Chinese see it? What kind of reactions did they draw? We haven't seen anything on the Chinese side about anything like that. But then again, we have a lot, weirdly, on Soviet decisions at very low levels, but for the Chinese, we have a little bit, but it's more at the strategic level. But we haven't seen anything. But again, what you're describing, I think if I remember from the interview, was that it was earlier in the crisis than.
It's not clear.
Well,
I think it may have been later.
nothing it's usually the several things that really scared them at the end of August, but it's not anything like we saw them doing something on the border that really scared us. So
do we
I see
have
Phil
time
has
to
a-
take? No, we're out of time. There is a question that has just come in for you. Maybe I'll just pass it for you to have a look at and respond to. But we're over time. So let me just say thank you very much for a really interesting seminar, and good luck with the book.
Thank you.